Welcome, welcome, welcome to Core Volunteer Training. Tonight's training is Lobbying 201, Planning and Practicing Effective Lobbying or Practicing Lobby Meetings. Really glad to have you here this evening so that you can practice and get some opportunities to learn how and practice meeting with your member of Congress this year for this March even for our online lobby meetings. Amy Bennett is going to walk us through a variety of details, and she is CCL's Director of Congressional Liaison and Lobby Days. And we're going to walk through a number of important considerations for preparing to meet and what an actual meeting with your member of Congress will look like. Even if in this new, it's not so new COVID reality anymore, in this ongoing, I should say, COVID reality that keeps on going like the Energizer Bunny, we are continuing to meet with our members. I'm your host, Tamara Staten. And before we dive too deep into our content this evening, I get to introduce the wonderful Amy Bennett. As Director of Congressional Liaisons and Lobby Days, Amy provides training and support to volunteer liaisons as they build relationships with congressional offices and help representatives move up the ladder of support for effective legislative action. She is responsible for organizing CCL's Lobby Days in Washington, D.C., including mentoring liaisons on how to schedule and organize congressional meetings and to maintain productive dialogues throughout the year. Just out of curiosity, by show of hands, or if you're in the, or you can say it in the chat, if you're a liaison, let us know. Just curious if any liaisons are on the call. Would also love to know if you are excited to be able to lobby for the first time. You can add first time in the chat, like I am ready to go to my first lobby meeting, whenever that is. All right, so we have a liaison from Hawaii. All right, Paul is in the house. Welcome, Paul. All right, so we have 3 goals for this evening. Number 1 is to understand the planning process behind our meeting preparations with members of Congress and their staff. Number 2, we want to demonstrate what respect-based relational meeting looks like and sounds like, as well as understand why we take this approach. It's a relatively unique approach. And we also want you to feel prepared for your own meeting and to feel confident in knowing where to go for support, tools, and resources. So, Amy, take her away.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Tamara. Happy you are here. And before we get started, I want to do a quick review. And first of all, what's our goal with a meeting with a member of Congress? It's relationship building. It's all about trust and moving your member up the ladder of support for becoming a climate champion. And how do we achieve it? And that's through respect and appreciation, appealing to the best in others, and being for something. And what's diving down into the approach, we want to find common ground and we want to build bridges, and we want to do that through shared values, social connections, and places that we care about. And CCL is grounded in one rule, and that is we treat everyone, even those who we disagree with respect, appreciation, and gratitude. And so let's talk about lobby meeting roles. To begin with, the central role for each of our meetings with a member of Congress is the leader. And the leader is the one who empowers everyone else to share and participate. They don't necessarily have to be the one at all who talks the most. And he's empowering especially the constituents to be involved so that we can build our capacity for this work. So the leader might facilitate the transitions. He might slow it down in certain sections to clarify we didn't understand what a member was saying or the staffer was saying, or to move it along. If the leader's not the liaison, then the leader's responsible for briefing the congressional liaison after the meeting. And for those of you who aren't liaisons, the liaison is the main point of contact with the member's office, and also is the one who kind of has a large hand in planning the meeting. And so the leader works collaboratively to assign the roles in a meeting. So an analogy that we might find useful is that of a conductor. So if you look at this like a orchestra, the CCL team leader is there to manage the meeting, but not to dominate the meeting. And the leader's not necessarily the one who talks the most, but empowers everyone to share and participate, especially, as I mentioned, the constituents. During the discussion part of the meeting, we want to ask open-ended questions and keep things focusing on affirming shared values and asking clarifying questions. So not to go too quickly, but to hear everything that the member or the staffer says. And the leader might not choose to be in charge of handling the transitions. He may hand that off to somebody else. And the leader might keep the conversation on track and help wrap things up. The leader will be the one to help the team settle on an appropriate supporting ask. Our main ask is usually support for the Energy Innovation Act, but there may be supporting asks that are more appropriate for that meeting. And Tamara's going to put a little link here in the chat to the role descriptions. And so the other meeting roles, depending on the size of the team, and if it's a small team, some people will take on multiple roles. Everybody's encouraged to participate in the discussion part, but keep in mind that the most powerful people in the meeting are the constituents. Those are the trusted messengers, the ones that the member of Congress, the staffer, will listen to the most. And so looking at these, as you might want to share in the chat, which roles do you think you might combine? Let's say if you only had a meeting team of 4 people. We usually have 6 people in a meeting, about 6 or 7. Which ones would you say you might combine? Jot that down in the chat. Which of these roles need to be matched to particular strengths of your team? So if you have, a time monitor, a note taker, an asker, a leaver, what kind of person would you assign to particular roles? An easy one might be the tech person, to have that be someone who understands computer technical issues, but give me some hints on that, and love to see that in the chat. So the appreciator, that's just keep in mind, doesn't it feel nice when you meet somebody and they say something nice about you right off the bat? I have a girlfriend who's in sales. She does that all the time. How does that change the way you listen when someone says something nice right off the bat? Now, what about the time monitor? Could the how would that time monitor support the meeting? So generally speaking, they're going to ask, how much time do you have for this meeting? And our goal is to have us talk about 50% of the time, and the staffer or the member of Congress talks 50% of the time. And the time monitor also tallies the number of open-ended questions the team asks. So we want to be sure we ask a few of those. And then there's the note taker or meeting minute taker. What kind of skills are needed for that? That person is specifically capturing what is said by the member or the staffer in the meeting versus us. We kind of know pretty much our pitch, but the most important thing, if you're scribbling fast, is to get what the member or the legislative aide says, and then be able to commit to typing up those notes and submitting them within 48 hours. The asker is the person who makes our ask and presents CCL's purpose and describes, in a couple of sentences, the bill. And that's good if it's someone who has a strong grasp of policy. And they might also be the one who presents in fact, they are the one who presents the one-page ask. There is the deliverer, the person who delivers constituent correspondence or certain reports to the meeting that might have been requested or that are relevant to the agenda. And then there's the person who tracks what is going to be needed for follow-up. Is there something that is requested that we send along? Maybe that person is responsible for, if we're there in person, getting everybody to sign a thank you card in the hallway right after we leave, or to maybe send the thank you note after. And then, of course, there is the tech support person, and that person needs to know about muting and unmuting people, as well as some other security issues. A couple of other opportunities there are, especially if you have extra people, someone to just observe, especially if it's a new person who doesn't want to take on a role. An observer might be designated to really watch for underlying needs and just jot down a few things that other people might miss. And then a photographer. We do ask permission to take a screenshot if we do that with the member or the staffer, and then save that for the team to share. So great thoughts, very good thoughts, everybody. And now let's move on to actually planning your meeting. What are we going to talk about? So prior to the meeting, you're going to, first of all, do your homework, do your research on the member. And it's really a great idea to script out what you think responses to any questions that you have might be. If you've done your homework, you'll kind of have a feeling how the member's going to respond to certain open-ended questions, but you're never quite positive. You want to utilize a meeting plan template, which we have on Community, which can walk you through this, especially if this is your first time. And so you plan out what's your strategy, what's your goals for your meeting. And then before you head into the meeting with your team, it's a good idea to discuss the importance of letting the member talk, or the staffer if you're meeting with the legislative aide. Allowing silence is really a good thing. It can be a little bit nerve-wracking if we have a role and we want to be sure we do it correctly. So it's really good to breathe and make sure we don't jump in too soon, but really listen fully. And if those of you who are familiar with motivational interviewing skills, to really look for opportunities to affirm any common ground that we have, ask clarifying questions, and that type of thing. So we can really make sure that the member or the staffer really gets to the heart of how they're trying to answer our questions. So we need to allow them that space. And before the meeting, personally, I like to offer permission to my fellow teammates to interrupt me if I go in and jump in too fast myself. I get really excited. You can tell I'm kind of a high energy person. So I actually like to give other members of my team complete permission to interrupt me if I'm moving too fast and we missed giving that staffer or member of Congress the time needed. So it's we don't want to cut them off. I'm actually going to in the role play, I'm going to catch myself going too fast. So you'll see that. Why don't you watch for that? That'll be something to see if you catch. So let's watch for that. And a little background research to give you an example of the research and planning we did with this role play we're going to have with Representative McKinley of West Virginia. A good place to start is what your members proud of. And if you go to their website and go to their press release page, you'll be able to see what they're most proud of. And Tamara's going to put this in the chat. You can see that he joined with Representative Kurt Schrader of Oregon at the last session of Congress to introduce the Clean Energy Future Innovation Act of 2020. And he's proud of this. It's a bipartisan proposal put forth by Republicans to accelerate the development and commercialization of clean energy technologies and establish clear and durable standards for their use in the electric power sector. So this is huge. The legislation would make a significant investments in the energy innovation and infrastructure, including carbon capture, advanced nuclear, renewables, efficiency, and storage. So after a decade of innovation, what it does is it establishes a technology neutral clean energy standard that would reduce CO2 emissions by 80% by 2050. And here's what Representative McKinley said about this policy. He said, America needs energy policy that can endure rather than one that changes after each election and judicial decision. Said McKinley, no policy can succeed without certainty, and certainty requires bipartisan consensus. Our approach will reduce carbon emissions while ensuring affordable and resilient power generated from all sources. Furthermore, by positioning America as a leader in innovation, it'll allow us to export technology to the rest of the world and provide a global solution to this problem. So we can see a lot about his priorities just from this press release and doing a little research on his website. On the next slide, we're going to show you what Representative McKinley just said recently in March 2021 during a webinar with the Bipartisan Policy Center called Advancing the Energy Transition with Innovation and a Clean Energy Standard. Again, it can be really helpful to script out when you're developing those open-ended questions, script out what you think his answers might be so that you can be prepared to respond and find common ground and so on. And we typed out the main points of this conversation in the video video that we're going to see next. There'll be bullet points you'll see on the left. So we can identify those shared values, acknowledge them, which is a great way of building trust, and help us ask better open-ended questions. It's great to practice ahead of time how you would restate what you heard the member say, and that helps them to confirm those common values underneath the concerns you just heard before responding with, we think the Energy Innovation Act would work so well. So in other words, you're acknowledging the stuff he really likes, and you're building the bridge to that common ground. So Tamara, how about a little context before we go on?
Yeah, sure. So before we listen to Representative McKinley's interview from earlier today with the Bipartisan Policy Center, I just wanted to note a couple of things. It's possible that you might tend towards the progressive end of the spectrum. And if that is the case, it may be helpful to think about this video as research. And I say that because it can just be helpful to notice what comes up for you in regards to thoughts and feelings, and having an awareness around potential strong reactions when we're listening to people that we want to work with can really help us in our conversations with those who have different perspectives. So Brooke, go ahead and cue it up.
Question, thanks. From Jonathan Berman. How does a carbon tax compare to what you're thinking about doing here?
Thus far, we have avoided that because we don't see there's an appetite for a carbon tax. We know people have talked about carbon tax or carbon pricing. We remember we went through years ago before I came here was a cap and trade issue. All those issues are somewhat polarizing. And ultimately, anytime you put a carbon tax or something like that on there, you're increasing the cost to the consumer. And the utility companies, it's just a pass through. The consumer is going to pay for it. I strongly believe that we won't need to do that. If we can do the innovation, finding ways to capture the carbon, we won't need to go there. We won't need to have that. The technology is still emerging, but it's already showing up. We have Net Power down in Texas has actually demonstrated using the alum cycle that they can go to zero emissions. Let's just find out how mechanically, how can we adopt that across the country? People flipping from the Rankine over to the alum cycle. Is that a way to save it? Let's find out. So this is part of this innovation for 10 years. For 10 years, no new regulations, but intense investment in innovation. And once we come out of that, then we're going to be able to transform that, transport that through trade or whatever to other nations. Because, as I said in my opening remarks, it's American can decarbonize. We can. But what about the rest of the world? When we're burning about 750 million tons, and China is burning 5 billion tons, in India 1.1 billion tons. Those are the nations we need to focus on. So we're going to show them through our innovation how they might be able to achieve it, and ultimately we'll have a cleaner environment. So thank you very much for the chance to chat with your group, and I hope we can follow up with us. This thing's I think it's one of the most important pieces of legislation that I've dealt with in the last 11 years.
Okay, well, there were some juicy nuggets there. We really got to know what he's thinking. So let's plan the meeting. So we know where our bridge issues are, if you watch those bullet points, and where we can give education. So it's important that we recognize we don't want to give too much information and focus on those opportunities to build trust. I mean, obviously this depends on where you're at with your member. Given the notes in our research, let's script out the meeting. Let's keep looking for what we can verbally appreciate, where we can say, I agree with you. Even though in committee hearings or presentations like this, they might be long, it's really worth listening to them to get a picture of what they're passionate about. Sometimes you get some really great tips about their passion and their point of view and what to anticipate. So in meetings, every interaction should we should help them want to see us again. We want the second date. So he provided some trusted sources like energy innovation, places like Net Power in Texas. So it's easy to slip up and ask a yes, no question and not ask an open-ended question. We'll go over that on the next slide. So give them time to think about things. When you ask that open-ended question, allow silence. That's okay. giving counterpoints might work for TV. And I think there even was a show that used to be called Counterpoint, but it's not good for meetings. We're not having a debate, and it can actually be counterproductive. So our goal, as I said, is to get the second date, and it's getting them to express common ground, and if possible, the benefits of our policy, if we get into that in detail, and having them identify barriers. The most effective way for them to change their minds is for them to verbalize common ground that we have out loud. So that's what we're trying to do. That's a motivational interviewing technique. So I want to invite you to share in the chat a closed-ended questions, one that we also can just say yes or no, and share an open-ended question, which usually starts with who, what, when, where, or how. So if you can think of a good question to ask in a meeting, let's put that in the chat, and then let us know what you think a yes-no question might be. All right, and we actually avoid the why question because it can put people on the defensive, though, so that's one to be careful with. Now, here's a bonus challenge for the chat. Knowing what you know about Representative McKinley, what's an open-ended question that you might consider asking in this meeting? All right, and before we begin next, let's walk through these 5 steps for listening, for having balanced listening, for providing information.
Awesome. I just want to highlight some thoughts coming in from the chat. So closed-ended, have you ever blank? So have you ever thought about changing your policy? Have you ever thought about upping that 80% to 90? That would be a yes or no question.
Right.
Open-ended, what do you think about having 80% by 2050? How did you come to that conclusion? Those are great open-ended questions, and it really fosters the conversation. What do you think is the best solution? Another great open-ended question. Do you think we need a carbon tax? Excellent yes or no question. An excellent yes or no question, but one we'd prefer to do is, what do you think is the best way to achieve net zero emissions by 2050? So yeah, you guys are totally nailing it. Awesome, great work. And again, we ask you these questions to help get your brain going, to help because it can be really hard to think of most of us in our culture are sort of tuned to the yes no question, and so it can really be really good to practice. Even writing down a list of open-ended questions to go into the meeting with can be very helpful. 5 steps to balanced listening. So your response might be something like, you want to reflect back the question or the concern you heard, and then you want to connect on shared values, which might sound something like this, Amy.
I'm glad you're thinking carefully about other countries' emissions. It sounds like it matters to you to drive down global emissions.
And then you want to listen to their response and come back with anything that you agree with them about. This is the bridge building part.
I agree with you. We need to spur innovation. America's a leader in tech, space, and medicine. Innovations needed so other countries can be effective reducing emissions.
Then you want to ask permission to share your point of view. Most people are more inclined to listen if they've given you permission to talk.
So true. May I tell you what I understand about an approach like the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act that makes me excited about how it will accelerate innovation?
And it's likely that they're not going to say no. Most people won't say, no, you can't. They'll just start talking about something else. But then you know that they're not ready to listen, right? But if they agree, which happens most of the time, like, yeah, go ahead, and they're open to more, then you can go down to a few more specifics. And so after sharing, you can ask for their thoughts about what you shared, and you can tailor what you do to their next response to that question that you just asked them. If they experience or express rather any resistance, then you can fall back to rapport building, which is basically relationship building. You can sit how they sit, you can talk how they talk. That's, rapport building 101 actually. And if they're open to or actively supportive, then you can talk about what they can do to move forward.
So in this case, you can share your perspective, maybe use some of the points about the policy's border carbon adjustment to address the congressman's concerns about other international actors stepping up to reduce emissions. There's plenty of resources on CCL community to help emphasize that big picture, which is very cool that Congressman McKinley has that big picture.
Definitely. So then you want to make a few points as opposed to delivering a soliloquy, I say, and then follow up with 1 or 2 open questions to find out how well they're receiving the information. And I mean, 1 at a time, right? You don't want to rapid fire them at them, give them a chance to respond. So that might sound like this, Amy, go ahead.
So what are your thoughts about a border adjustment satisfying Republican concerns? And then you might ask, how would that affect your decision on the passage of a policy that puts a strong fee on carbon in place?
And so then you just continue listening and you reflect and you share small bits of information and then you stop. You give them some time to think about things. It can take a few conversations for people to change their point of view. In general, we want to be as aware of where the other person is in terms of the Yale 6 Americas. And those 6 Americas, in case this is new to you, is alarmed, concerned, cautious, disengaged, doubtful, or dismissive. Our goal really should be to move the other person up this continuum from where they are in a stepwise fashion. We're not going to move somebody from dismissive to alarmed. It's unrealistic. And so we risk triggering the backfire effect if we try to push people too rapidly. Even if we try to push people, we risk triggering that relationship opportunity. So every interaction, like Amy's been stressing, is optimally they want to see us again. We want to be invited back.
All right. Well, here's a final slide to review before we begin our mock meeting. So the suggested meeting outline is pretty simple, a beginning, a middle, and an end. So we're going to go through each segment and then pause in between to review and take your questions. So what I'm going to do now is demonstrate a meeting, and I'll narrate in the demonstration. We'll stop at certain points to debrief just what happened. I'll play the meeting leader, who also happens to be a constituent of Congressman McKinley, and Tamara's going to play McKinley. Do you have your mustache, Tamara? So we'll go through this beginning, middle, and end for the initial meeting. And this is Congressman McKinley from Wheeling, West Virginia, the 1st District. Our agenda is pretty broad because we're going to say that this is our very first meeting. We want to establish trust and show respect and appreciation. And because it's the first meeting, first of what we hope is a long-term relationship, it's not a one-time event. You'll see the pace we take. And of course, we want to advise them on our policy and let them know what we're doing and that we want to create political will for them and work with them. But we also need to be prepared to do a lot of listening. So let's start this out. Hello, my name is Amy Bennett with Citizens Climate Lobby, a volunteer organization. Well, first of all, Congressman McKinley, we want to acknowledge how busy you are with the pandemic and the way the economy is struggling. We're appreciative of all you've done for your constituents during this challenging time, and we thank you for carving out the time with us.
Well, it's great to see you engaged in the political process. I'm glad to meet with you.
Thank you, Congressman. We know it's a busy day for you and how much, we want to ask how much time you have for this meeting.
I do have a committee meeting in 20 minutes, so that means I can give you about 15.
Well, thank you. My name's Amy Bennett, and I'm a constituent of yours living in Wheeling, West Virginia, and I'm a school teacher. I'm here today because I'm worried about the kind of world the kids I teach will grow up in. And given these times, I want to do my part to make it as safe as possible for them.
Well, Amy, you know I served 14 years in the West Virginia legislature fighting for school children and seniors. I believe that government should exercise its powers to look after our most vulnerable citizens. I admire you for devoting your life to educating our children. I know our federal government continues to screw this up by trying to impose its will on our local school districts.
Well, thank you for the kind words, Congressman. We'd like to start by telling you how much we admire your bipartisan work to introduce the legislation that protects retired coal miners' pensions. My family's been part of that proud tradition, and your work means that my elders will be looked out for after the work, all the hard work they gave.
Well, thank you for recognizing that, Amy. It is so important to me that all West Virginians know that if they work hard, then they'll be able to retire comfortably.
Well, that's fantastic. Since we just have a few minutes, Congressman, let me briefly tell you why we're here, and then we'd like to hear your thoughts on the policy that we're supporting, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. Our policy is to create, our purpose, CCL's purpose is to create the political will for a livable world. Since 2008, we've met with congressional offices 10,374 times. We've gotten repeated feedback that we're one of the most prepared and respectful advocacy groups on the Hill. Back home in Wheeling, we're working to create the political space we know you'll need to support the policies that manage the risks we face with climate change. Over the past couple of months, your constituents have been expressing support for climate action, and our volunteers have collected endorsements from community leaders in Wheeling. Our ask for you is to support a bipartisan bill that puts a steadily rising fee on fossil fuel emissions and returns all the revenues back to American households. It's good for people, the economy, and effective at managing the risks we face with our changing climate. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this approach on managing climate risk. We'd also love to hear your thoughts on responsible energy policy in general. Where would you like to begin?
So what did you notice about what Amy did well? Type your observations in the chat as we process and debrief this initial intro section of the meeting. She also asked questions about how much time he had. She stayed focused. She also expressed some open body language, and she didn't necessarily take the bait when she could have gone off and talked about education, but she kept it on track. So Amy, do you want to talk about the other parts of the agenda?
Sure. Well, it's in terms of the appreciation part, thanking the member for something we sincerely care about. And I think that's really important. We are all about being authentic. Asking how much time is really important, because no matter what we might hope for a 10 to 15 minute meeting with a face-to-face, which is with a member, or maybe a 20 to 30 to even 40-minute meeting with a staffer. That can change once you actually get into the meeting. They can be called away, they get another appointment. So you always want to ask. Introductions, obviously it was just two people in the role play, but you want to do those very briefly and yet to the point. Appreciation, of course, I mentioned. There is a certain amount you do want to say in terms of stating who we are and what our proposal is. That doesn't really take very much time, but you want to be sure to get that out there in the first part, because if you miss it, you can be halfway through the meeting and they think you're talking about cap and trade and that you're some other organization. So you want to be very clear on getting that out initially, so you're just leveling the playing field. We're here about carbon, this particular bill, and we're Citizens Climate Lobby, and here's what our purpose is, and our ask is going to be for support of that bill. Now, we always want to let them know that is what we're after, is support of that bill. We're not going to demand he answer us right then. We just want to be clear about our purpose, why we're here, what we stand for, and then move on to talk about really how he feels. And so you also end up adapting. What if he does have to only give us 5 minutes? Then things are going to have to be very brief. You have to kind of read the room, and absolutely, he wanted to go talk about something else. Sometimes if they know that they've got limited time, or they're not going to be able to tell you exactly what you want to hear, they can go off and talk about the school district for the whole time you have. So you want to be very careful to redirect back to the conversation there, not take the bait, and just be very clear and specific and authentic. So any other thoughts, Tamara, on that?
Nope, I think we're ready to go on to the middle.
All right, back to you then.
I'm beginning to hear more and more about the need to address climate change. I'm balancing those concerns with others in my district on fixed incomes that have highlighted the impacts of any policy that would raise the cost of their energy. Here in West Virginia, we still have a strong coal sector. And when it comes to energy policy, Amy, you can put me in the all of the above energy category. I do think climate change is a problem, but America cannot do this alone. We have to get the rest of the world involved. The people of West Virginia sent me here with a clear message to stop the federal government's overreach. We do not like the hammer of regulation.
So what I'm hearing you say is that both the economy and the environment are important to you, not one or the other. Is that a fair assessment?
Sure, I mean, a lot of negative things are said about me because I'm putting our country first, but a first environmental agenda isn't good for business.
Well, we can certainly appreciate being unfairly labeled. I mean, we're often portrayed as being anti-business, but nothing could be further from the truth. We, just like you, want the economy and the environment to flourish. So have you, by any chance, been briefed on the Energy Innovation Act and how it might compare to your similar bill, the Clean Energy Future through Innovation Act?
Well, I know my aide has reviewed it in detail, Amy, but why don't you tell me about it?
Well, what we're both proposing is that we need to provide incentives for our economy to transition to the biggest market opportunity of the 21st century, clean energy. So if the US could expand its share of the market in producing clean energy product and the technology to capture carbon, we're talking about trillions of dollars. Here's how this, and then I would go on to explain the carbon fee and dividend to him, and all the border adjustment and the regulatory simplification, and then I would ask, how does that sound to you?
Well, let me be clear, Amy. I want to support policies that will not kill jobs here in West Virginia. If we impose additional costs on Americans, it's our own constituents that will suffer. If America lowers its emissions, it would not solve the problem. You'd have to be delusional to think that it would stop floods or droughts.
Well, actually, the United States is in a position to lead the world. Oh, I'm sorry for interrupting. Let me go back and make sure I understand your question. Are you concerned about the economic effects locally of what might happen if the United States takes action without other large emitters following suit?
Well, yes, I am. I mean, we don't live in a vacuum. China and India's emissions went up from 2000 to 2016 by 290% and 235%, and the US was only 16%. Unless India reduces emissions, expect major climate change regardless of US action.
I'm glad you're thinking carefully about other countries' emissions. It sounds like it matters to you to drive down global emissions. When I first became concerned about the climate, I struggled with that as well. May I tell you about what I found out about the carbon border adjustment aspect of our proposal that put me more at ease?
Sure, put me at ease too, please.
Congressman McKinley, knowing your economic background, I think you'll appreciate what we've learned. The Energy Innovation Act includes a carbon border adjustment that our international trade experts assure us that complies with WTO commitments. It would impose a tariff on other countries that don't have a similar carbon fee in their country to ensure protection for domestic manufacturing. What are your thoughts about a carbon border adjustment satisfying your concerns?
So tell me, how does that work? All right, so let's pause the meeting again and recap the middle part. And in regards to Amy's eagerness to respond, so Amy caught herself having an immediate answer without really listening to Representative McKinley's question. One of the goals that we have tonight is helping you all feel ready and comfortable with pulling yourself back. This can happen a lot. It happens to a lot of us who have been in a lot of lobby meetings. And so how would you handle it if someone else does it? How would you handle it if somebody else, right? You don't want to, can't kick them in the knee on Zoom. I mean, we don't like to do that so much in our real actual lobby meetings either, but it's important to practice finding a tactful way to do the same thing if another member in the group also jumps in without asking permission to proceed. So for example, I might say, hey, I think it's important that Congressman McKinley, this isn't me as Tamara in a meeting. This is not me as Representative McKinley. Okay. I might say to Amy, I think it's important that Congressman McKinley clarifies his thoughts before we go further. Is that okay with you, Amy?
One, just notice that we didn't correct him for going to task on his position for climate or any other statements. You know, we kind of know, like we talked about earlier, that we see things differently, but why start with something that will put us into a situation where one of us has to be right and the other person is wrong, right? Because we know, you know, that he's probably just not on exactly the same page as us, but there's some things that we do have in common. So doesn't it make more sense to listen and ask additional questions so that we can find that common ground and say where we agree, even if it's something small, and build the relationship from there. And notice how many questions that we asked. We're trying to draw out more information so that we can discover where we have that common ground, but also discover where we have misconceptions, not necessarily to address them right then and there, but to find out where there might be misconceptions.
Thanks, Amy. So we've also talked about asking for permission to proceed. May I tell you about the carbon adjustment? So again, another question for you personally, and would love to hear your thoughts in the chat. What do you notice in your own life about the other person when you ask permission to share versus just sharing? So imagine you're talking to somebody in your life and you say, hey, can I tell you about something? Can I tell you about what my best friend did last week that just drove me crazy, or what my dad did? What do you notice about the other person in any changes they may or may not make, any body language that you might notice, any change in tone of voice, they soften and feel respected. They seem more interested. They usually open to it. They sit or stand up and they face me, their eyes are open, they feel less defensive. How awesome would that be if those were the people that we got to, if that's how we got to interact with people, even when they have a differing opinion than we do, right? So that's the beauty. It may seem sort of fake and sort of like we're buttering people up, but it's actually just human nature. So we can play on our tendencies as humans and use this to our benefit in getting in making progress on the actions that we want to take for climate.
So Congressman, I see that we're nearing the end of our time with you. I think it'll be important working together to understand what next steps you would like our local group to do to help you, so you'd be willing to support a bill that puts a fee on carbon and returns the proceeds to American households.
Well, I think it's a novel approach you have, but I do have some reservations. I would like to find out more about how this affects the pocketbooks of my constituents.
I understand. This is our first meeting after all. I'll send you the household impact study for West Virginia's 1st district so you can see how the dividend would affect people and affect people at the various income levels in your district. We'd be delighted to sit down with your staff and review those details and more about the Energy Innovation Act and answer any questions that you might have and see what, if anything, might be preventing you from co-sponsoring the bill. Is there anyone in the district whose support is important for you to have so that we might speak with them?
I'd be delighted to have you meet with my staff. It seems like I got the easier task. If you're going to speak with folks back home, then I may recommend you speak with Mayor Lean. Being a former utility CEO, he's someone I listen to regarding energy issues.
Absolutely. Thank you for that recommendation. As we said earlier, we're trying to make it easier for you to support our policy. So we'll make an appointment to see the mayor. I'm going to leave you with this one-page ask. And how would you like me to follow up with additional materials in the future?
You could follow up with Joanna through email.
Great. Congressman, one last thing before we leave. Would you mind telling us with whom you enjoy working with on the other side of the aisle?
Well, as you know, I'm new and there are a lot of ill feelings around here, but I do try to work across the aisle on many topics.
That must be frustrating. Is there one person that you've gotten to know?
Congressman Pallone and I have gotten to know each other on the Energy and Commerce Committee, and we have been on Zoom together a lot during the pandemic. He's not as bad as he seems on TV.
Okay, so that's the end of our demonstration for an initial meeting. Let's switch gears to one thing I did want to point out is the one yes/no question that it is okay to ask is, will you support our bill? Because we want the yes. I noticed that in the chat earlier. So, but at the end of the meeting, we want to again, ask for support of the bill unless we know absolutely that a secondary ask is possible. So after you leave the meeting, you would either want to schedule a follow-up debrief with your team on a separate Zoom line or a separate meeting. Or when we go to DC in person, we actually leave the office, walk, about 50 feet down the hall, and then do a debrief so that we're really sure we understood everything that was said. Things can go very fast. One person can hear one thing, so it's another person can hear another. So we clarify that so the note taker can clarify their notes. And we want to confirm whatever follow-up items need to be done. Who's going to write and deliver the thank you? Who's going to file the meeting minutes online? Who's going to send the requested information to the member or the staffer? You usually send it to the staffer, like if they wanted a particular report. Who's going to add a post about the meeting to the social media feed? Like if there was a photographer who took a screenshot, who's going to post that? And who has plans to maybe generate a letter to the editor which mentions the member of Congress by name. I'll bring up a topic here is we don't share what was actually said in the meeting, but we can bring up general things like we had a great meeting with McKinley, that type of thing. Many of our members bring a thank you note on lobby day and everybody signs it and brings it right back into the office afterwards. And other times online we do a kudoboard.com has a great way of doing thank yous.
Yeah, so for many of you on the line, as you shared, this might be your first meeting, whatever meeting that you're going to go into next will be your first. And so as a result, you might feel somewhat nervous or unqualified, totally normal feeling. It's also important to acknowledge that. And it's also important to do what you can to move through that, because you have just as much right to be there as any one of the other constituents in your district or even the other volunteers, and your voice matters. So in order to help alleviate these feelings, just keep in mind another important meeting element is play. So we are in the relationship business, and that's one of our strengths. Also, so never underestimate the power of injecting personality and fun into a staffer MOC meeting, because those are the meetings they remember at the end of the day. They're in meeting after meeting after meeting. So spice up your meetings, jab them in the ribs. Okay, maybe not that, but so say you found out the staffer grew up on a ranch, just go ahead and ask if he knows how to wrangle cattle. If your MOC went to a rival school, then you could bring that up in a jovial way. And another thing that you could do is you can ask them about pictures or displays in the office. I saw a canoe hanging on the wall in the office, and I'm a canoer, and that was a really fun thing to reference. So it also keep in mind you want to include the staffer in the round of introductions, and that ends up leaving them feeling included, and because they're human too. And just remember that these personal, playful moments will help build a stronger relationship and make the meetings more fun for everyone.
And, I'm just going to jump to slide 32, Brooke, because we are short on time here. I'd like to just point out the importance of practice. And I know, Smriti, you said you were nervous. One of the things to help you get over that, because I get nervous too. And in fact, it's quite common that everyone is nervous, and even the member himself might appreciate the fact that you care enough to be nervous. That's actually a sign of respect in many ways. But what our executive director taught me is that he practices what he's going to say in a mirror. Like, let's say you did do the introduction part where you were the only constituent, and maybe you get to get that over with early so you can get over your nervousness, and you say, well, my name is Amy Bennett, and maybe you have 3 or 4 sentences, but he rehearses in the mirror. I like to rehearse to my dogs because they're a lot more forgiving, but rehearsing is so important. And some of the advantages is it builds up our reputation. It does demonstrate that we were respectful enough to rehearse our lines in advance, or not that we want it to come off like sounding at lines, but we just practice it. And it develops trust with the team. Most of our teams actually have 1, 2, or even 3 practice sessions on Zoom before they meet, and it does wonders to just practice it. You get all the goofy stuff out before you actually do the meeting, and you learn about each other. It's really, really helpful, and it helps you just to learn how to be present and how to be adaptive. So when we practice together, you just never know what scenarios are going to play out, so you might practice a few different things, and that also reminds us that we always need to be present and actually listen to what is being said by the member or the staffer and respond to what we're hearing, and just remain flexible, just like we would if we were taking a walk with our friend.
Thanks, Amy Woodbrook. And I just want to say thank you to each and every one of you for being here. Thank you for being so committed to lobbying around climate. If you do have any questions, you can email amy@citizensclimate.org. You can also go to the forums, which is a great place to get any of your questions answered. community.citizensclimate.org/forums. I will put this information in the chat for you all. Thank you so much for being here.
It was just great to have you all on.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration. And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.